I would like to get one piece of business out of the way just at the beginning of the meeting, which is our budget request for payment for witnesses for 288 in the sum of $14,400. And that item, I think everybody has a copy of it. Any comments? Yes, Mr. Warwa.
First of all, do we need a mover to discuss this?
Sure. Mr. Godfrey moves.
And I'd like to speak to him.
Okay. Mr. Warwa.
Well, Mr. Chair, I'll be supporting the motion, but begrudgingly. 288, we've heard from the witnesses to this point, that is, would have been relevant in 1998. And we've heard to this point that we cannot meet our Kyoto targets, and I'd expect that science will support that. So 288, supported by the Liberals in the bloc, is an irrelevant bill, and for us to be asking for witnesses to support an irrelevant bill, Mr. Speaker, I think is a waste of taxpayers' dollars. But on the other hand, this is before the committee, and we have a list of witnesses, and so under that spirit, I will be supporting it, but begrudgingly.
Any other comments? Mr. Bergras, do you have a comment?
Well, I find it rather deplorable to hear the comments of the parliamentary secretary. I'll give him a chance to put in his earpiece so he hears what I'm having to say through the interpretation. I find it very deplorable to hear the comments of the parliamentary secretary who regrets that we're studying this bill. There's a flagrant lack here on the part of the parliamentary secretary to recognize the fundamental basis of our parliamentary democracy. We're looking at extra votes here for the study of a bill, a government bill, which has already gone through second reading. It's absolutely normal that we be looking at this bill in committee. It would be voted in second reading, and it should be studied in committee. The parliamentary secretary may be opposed to this bill. That, Mr. Chairman, has nothing to do with it. The fact is we're here to study the bill because that is the will of the majority of the House, and this is the will of the majority of Canadians and Quebecois. So I'd like to make sure that we move forward with the vote on this supplementary budget. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would add, not only does this represent the majority, but also international commitments made by Canada. So I think it's vital that we look at this question in depth and in detail.
Carried on division. On division. I'd like to welcome our guests, and as our practice, I think most of you are here, and certainly our members from health and environment are here, and certainly we invite you to intervene where necessary and respond to our panelists here. Anyway, if we could start, we'll try to go 10 minutes per witness, and then open it up to our members to ask questions. And we'll begin with Ms. Coombs.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of Parliament. It's a pleasure to be here today to continue discussions on CEPA review, and in particular how substances are regulated and managed under this important piece of legislation, and we appreciate the opportunity to make a presentation. First, I'd like to introduce our association. The Canadian Consumer Specialty Products Association is a national trade association that represents 40 member companies across Canada, collectively a $20 billion industry and employing 12,000 people and over 100 facilities across the country. Our companies manufacture, process, package, and distribute consumer and institutional specialty products such as soaps and detergents, pest control products, aerosols, hard surface disinfectants, deodorizers, and automotive chemicals. CEPA governs all of our ingredients in our products. And for a visual of our products, I have provided our one-pager, Imagine Life Without You, which was passed around by the clerk. I'm sure that most of you have recognized some of these products that are used in your home. Today, CCSPA has provided committee members with a brief on today's topics. The questions in the committee's topic list posted on the web for this discussion included the following. What information should the government require of industry and who should assess that information? What level of public disclosure should there be regarding data and its analysis? And where should the burden of proof lie? In my presentation today, I will outline the current processes and our comments on the law and regulations. Firstly, I wish to clarify that the terms new, and existing that I'll use during this presentation are those used by companies, officials, and involved stakeholders when discussing regulations and the legislation of SEPA. So to address the first question, how are substances assessed under SEPA and what information is required, I'd like to start with new substances of SEPA. The new substance notification regulations are regulations that govern on how new substances are assessed and approved under SEPA. The regulations have been in place since 1994, but were retroactive and reach back to 1987 to assess new substances. These regulations require that a company or individual proposing to bring a new substance into the Canadian marketplace must provide an information and data package for government assessment to Health Canada and to Environment Canada. The regulations are very clear about what information must be provided so that Environment Canada and Health Canada assessors can make a proper determination. Both departments review the information and data if there are any, and to determine if there are any potential environmental and/or human health concerns. It is CCSPA's position that these regulations are science-based, rigorous, predictable, and progressive. Progressive we mean as they're based on volume. What this means is that the higher the volume of a substance manufactured or imported into Canada, the more data a company must provide to the government. The initial submission determines the potential impacts on human health, safety, and the impacts on the environment. Then there are triggers in place for additional data to be generated and submitted based on the volume to ensure that there are no impacts on human health, safety, or the environment. Information and data requirements are quite rigorous and are clearly spelled out in the regulations. Examples of the information and data that's required to be submitted, such things as the annual quantity that's going to be used in Canada, the uses, including those in end-use products, if the substance may be in products intended to used by or for children. Minimum test data includes water, solubility, impurities, biodegradation test data, skin irritation, toxicity to fish, algae, mammalian testing, as well as mutagenicity data. There are 12 schedules of information under the regulations that are required to be submitted to the government based on the volume. Canada's new substance notification regulations are as stringent and as robust as any OECD country's new chemical program. I would suggest that if the committee would like to have more discussion on the 12 schedules, that we might wish to have Environment Canada or Health Canada outline those provisions. I would like to note that these regulations have been developed in consultation with stakeholders and were revised in 2005 after consensus recommendations were made on the regulations and guidelines. For existing substances, government has just finished the first phase of the categorization and screening of the domestic substances list, that is categorization. Canada is the first country in the world to comprehensively review its existing substances, and it's leading the world. This process took 6 years to complete. Environment Canada and Health Canada led a process to categorize 23,000 substances on the domestic substances list, the DSL. That program was science-based and was consultative throughout the timeline. Just a reminder that the domestic substances list is comprised of many substances such as gas, building blocks for plastics, food, pharmaceuticals, ingredients for paint, vitamins, fragrances, flavorings. It's quite a range. The categorization process followed science-based criteria for substances to meet, and that was persistent inherently toxic, bioaccumulative inherently toxic, persistent bioaccumulative inherently toxic, or the greatest potential for human exposure. As per our brief to the committee in June of this year, we stated that the CSDSL program was a success of SEPA. We also included in that brief the success of the new substance notifications applying to the substances in Food and Drug Act products over the past 5 years, which again, in our opinion, is most beneficial since those regulations are science-based, predictable, and rigorous. As a result of this program of categorization and screening, it is CCSPA's understanding that Canada has identified approximately 4,000 substances as having met the categorization criteria and may require further in-depth study and assessment by the government. While the results of the programs have yet to be made public, with an actions plan from Minister Ambrose and Clement, CCSPA has challenged this committee and the government that the list of potentially 4,000 substances need to be put in context and communicated properly to Canadians. As discussed in September, previous witnesses have been quoted in our national newspapers characterizing the list as the baddies of the bad or the worst of the worst. And substances on the list will include things, we are told that it will include such things as tamoxifen, which is a life-saving cancer drug, titanium oxide, a key ingredient in sunscreen which prevents cancer, vinegar, almond flavoring, and vitamin A, just to name a few. Instead of scaring Canadians and not advising them of the facts, we should be telling them about the enormous work that this government has undertaken and their plans to address concerns with all stakeholders, but most importantly, put into context as to what the list really means to Canadians. The example of tamoxifen is excellent because, of course, that substance meets the criteria because it's designed to kill. And we ensure that the intent is to keep that substance available to consumers. Therefore, it is critical that these results have some risk-benefit communications. As per our September 26th submission and presentation to the committee, we are again requesting the government to develop a proactive communication strategy to inform Canadians about the program and the results so that they're informed and they can make balanced decisions. It is also our expectation that the second phase of CSDSL screening will have the two departments conducting both rapid and in-depth screening risk assessments. Information for that second phase of the CSDSL program will be assessing existing substances similar to how new substances are assessed. The major difference is going to be between the CSDSL program and the new substance program are the possible, we'll call them data gaps. The term data gap is used when some tests have been conducted on a substance, but other tests may not appear to have been conducted. If the government has identified a data gap for a substance, it does not automatically mean that no tests exist. Companies may have conducted assessments on these substances to ensure human and environmental safety as part of industry's commitment to providing safe and effective products for consumers. Government will be identifying data gaps as it may prevent them to make informed decisions on the assessment of a substance. Government will undoubtedly be challenging industry to close that data gap and provide the information necessary for the government to reach an assessment conclusion. CCSPA members are and are willing to proactively provide these data to fill the gaps as long as the process for screening and moving forward is science-based and there's due process for comments prior to any public decisions being made. Government will also likely be using publicly available data and data submitted by companies to make their assessments. Canada will also be using results of studies and substance assessments carried out by other OECD jurisdictions such as Europe, US, and Japan. Industry is also involved in other programs to ensure data gaps are filled. For example, the OECD and US high production volume challenge programs are producing information sets that are being reviewed by various regulators around the world. And these regulatory reviews will be used in Canada, no doubt. Overall, CCSPA is confident that the second phase of the categorization and screening program will operate efficiently under CEPA. To answer the question of how much information should be publicly disclosed, it is our opinion that CEPA provides the Minister with broad authority to determine what information they consider to be confidential, and the authority to disclose confidential information if the Minister deems it to be in the public's interest. I will be speaking to CEPA Part 11, 313 through 321, which deal with the disclosure of information. Section 313 allows individuals and companies to request information they submit to the government to be treated as confidential. However, there are many instances where the government, under CEPA, require companies to submit confidential information concerning the substances they use. Section 315 of CEPA provides the Minister with the extraordinary power to disclose confidential business information that is made available to them if, in the Minister's opinion, the disclosure of such information is clearly in the public's best interest and outweighs any material or financial loss or competitive position of a company or person that provided that information. Section 316 also allows the Minister to disclose confidential information to a physician or medical professional. And Section 319 of the Act allows the Minister to create regulations for what information must accompany a request of confidentiality. In the essence, the Minister can set the rules concerning circumstances which they would consider information submitted to them to be confidential. To answer the final question, who bears the burden of proof? First and foremost, our members' number one priority is the health and safety of Canadians and their environment. While industry takes it upon itself the responsibility for bringing new technology to Canada. We also determine the proper use and application of substances. Before a substance is brought to market, industry conducts numerous in-house tests and risk assessments to assure that substances in our products can be used safely and human health and the environment will not be compromised. Industry also determines how the substance should be used so that risks are mitigated, and this is accomplished via handling instructions, precautions on the label, disposal information. Industry takes its obligation towards the proper and sound management of substances very seriously. However, it is the government who sets the parameters of what it takes to have the government approve a new substance or continue with the substances on the DSL. It is the government that sets the parameters for the regulation, determines the scientific criteria, and makes the final decision if that substance is allowed to be manufactured or imported into Canada. Therefore, it is our opinion that both industry and government have a role to play to ensure that the appropriate assessment of substances is conducted. Mr. Chair and members of Parliament, CCSPA and our member companies stand by that the ingredients are used safely in our products are safe when used according to directions. Thank you for your time, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Good, thank you. Ms. Ginsburg.
Good afternoon. My name is Jessica Ginsburg, Special Projects Counsel at the Canadian Environmental Law Association, also known as CELA. I'd like to introduce Kapil Khatter, Director of the Pollution Watch Program on Health and Environment, which is a joint initiative of CELA and Environmental Defense. Also sitting with me today is Faye de Leon, researcher at CELA. Turning now to burden of proof. The burden of proof issue is extremely important from a number of perspectives: historical, economic, and scientific. Historically, approximately 23,000 substances were allowed to enter the Canadian market without any toxicological information or assessment. These substances, now known as the existing substances, may exhibit any number of hazardous properties. The burden was placed on government to try to identify priority substances requiring assessment. First, through the creation of 2 priority substances lists in 1989 and 1995, and more recently through the categorization exercise. Identifying and assessing substances using the 2 priority substances lists proved to be extremely inefficient, expensive, and ultimately ineffectual. Only 69 substances and groups received assessments, and there still have not been regulatory actions taken to prohibit or eliminate these substances. The categorization exercise has attempted to prioritize the remaining backlog of existing substances, but this initiative has been similarly hampered by the scarcity of available information and the lack of onus on industry to provide the missing data. In July 2006, Environment Canada released figures indicating that there were over 1,000 substances considered not to have met the categorization criteria simply due to the fact that the department lacked sufficient information on which to base its decisions. At no time during the categorization exercise did government require industry to fill in these data gaps by conducting toxicological testing, despite repeated recommendations to this effect from NGO participants. The failure to gather data on these substances so as to deal with them in a scientifically valid way runs counter to the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle is a CEPA guiding principle, and government is obliged to exercise its duties in a precautionary manner where possible. The next phase of work will require government to conduct screening assessments on approximately 4,000 substances that are expected to meet the categorization criteria. If government continues to bear the burden for investigating the toxicity of these substances, this screening process is anticipated to extend over a period of decades. Again, it is important to note that these substances are already in Canadian commerce. Therefore, our citizens and our environment will continue to be exposed to them over this prolonged period of time. It is important that the Act be amended to place greater responsibility on industry for its substances in order that prompt action can be taken on the most threatening ones. In considering how to amend CEPA, special attention should be paid to Section 71(1)(c). Under this section, government can require a proponent of a substance to conduct toxicological tests. However, government's authority is curtailed by the requirement in Section 72 that the minister first have a reason to suspect that the substance is toxic or capable of becoming toxic. There is a lack of clarity regarding the suspicion of toxicity threshold and the degree of certainty which is required in order to meet it. The new substances regime places a greater onus on industry to produce information. Notifiers are required to prepare and submit small data sets before chemicals can be newly introduced into the Canadian market. However, as with existing substances, the ministers may only request additional toxicological tests under Section 74 where they suspect that a substance is toxic or capable of becoming toxic. The final report of the multi-stakeholder consultations on the new substances notification regulations identified a number of concerns and confusions around Section 84 and said that the ultimate goal would be to amend SEPA to incorporate information gathering authorities. Turning now to our recommendations. Number 1, the minister's power to require industry to conduct toxicological testing and submit the results under Section 71 1C and 84 1C should be unconstrained by the prerequisite that the ministers suspect a substance is toxic. Such a prerequisite weakens the minister's ability to shift the burden of proof onto the proponent of a substance. Number 2, at all phases of the information gathering and assessment process, reverse onus should apply. Accordingly, it should be industry's responsibility to demonstrate the safety of their substances. Examples of this approach can be found in the authorization process under REACH and in portions of the revised registration regime of the Pest Control Products Act. There should also be a specified time limitation to ensure that industry provides this information promptly upon request. Number 3, in order to achieve this objective, the following sections of SEPA will require amendment. Section 73, dealing with the categorization of substances. Section 74, dealing with screening assessments. Section 75, dealing with substances which have been controlled by other jurisdictions. And Section 76, dealing with full assessments for priority substances. Number 4, precaution should be exercised in the absence of data, and uncertain substances should not be allowed on the market since industry has not discharged its obligation of demonstrating safety. Moving on now to confidentiality. The issue of confidentiality has far-ranging implications for transparency, precautionary action, and the public's right to know about substances that may have an impact on their health and their environment. The public's right to know must take precedence over industry claims that competitiveness requires confidentiality. Sections 313 to 321 of SEPA set out the general requirements for claiming confidentiality. They hold that a person who provides information to the minister under this Act may request in writing that the information be kept confidential. Section 314 specifies that the minister will not disclose the information unless a legal test is met, as set out in Sections 315 to 317. The guidelines for the notification and testing of new substances provide additional details. Under the guidelines, notifiers may claim confidentiality so long as they satisfy 6 general criteria and sign a certification statement attesting to the accuracy of their claim. Little information has been reported about whether and how the confidentiality provisions have been applied. Confidentiality requests are not dealt with in a consistent manner across government departments. For instance, the certification statement is not uniformly applied, and at times the 6 criteria to be met by notifiers are listed without an "and" separating them, causing confusion about whether one or all of the criteria must be met. In some departments, all information received from a notifier is treated as confidential unless the company provides explicit written consent for the government to disclose it. Additionally, confidentiality is maintained between government agencies which have not signed information sharing agreements, so it's possible that notification packages may not be shared where the same substance is notified to different agencies under 2 or more acts. As a result, public access to information is jeopardized and consistency in government decision-making is challenged. Turning now to recommendations. Number 1, the committee should cull and review evidence on the actual use of confidentiality under SEPA in order to determine how and to what extent the provisions have been used in the interest of public health, public safety, and the protection of the environment. Number 2, according to Canada's international commitments, SEPA provisions should ensure that information on chemicals relating to the health and safety of humans and the environment is not regarded as confidential. Number 3, SEPA should contain legally binding requirements to be met by a notifier in order to claim confidentiality. There should be a presumption that confidentiality will not be granted unless certain conditions are met, rather than the opposite presumption which currently exists. Number 4, notifiers should always be required to provide evidence substantiating their claims of confidentiality. Number 5, summaries of all notification packages with confidentiality claims should be made public prior to the final assessment decisions. Number 6, where confidentiality is claimed, the company's chief executive officer should be required to attest to the fact that the confidentiality criteria have been met. Currently, only the individual submitting the notification package is required to sign the certification statement. Finally, number 7, confidential information should be shared freely among all government departments involved in the assessment of substances. Formally negotiated information sharing agreements should not be required between government departments which are involved in reviewing notification packages. Thank you for taking the time to hear from me today.
Thank you very much. We'd like to welcome Mr. Larson. He is filled in just for members' information. Mr. Graham was unable to attend, the Vice President, so we have the President, Mr. Larson, here in his place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I apologize for our last-minute substitution. Getting the President rather than the Vice President may be a step down in the world. But I would like to take a moment to talk with the committee about our views on the science assessment and focus on the use of the science assessment as a basis for the toxics determination under SEPA. My industry has been involved in this issue since the mid-90s with a PSL priority substances list proposal to evaluate road salt and ammonia in the aquatic environment as SEPA toxic. So our experience on this is very real and very directly affected our industry, which manufactures plant nutrients for use by farmers to grow food. The proposal for ammonia in the aquatic environment was hinged on a problem that we have with municipal wastewater treatment plant effluent. The challenge with road salt was a concern that municipalities were exceeding the necessary requirements for public safety, and when they decided to define the package for road salt, they included 3 chloride-based products: sodium chloride, which is of course salt, potassium chloride, which is potash, which is a fertilizer, and another one. Now, the reason that there was an inclusion of potassium chloride was simply because it was a residual product, you might say an impurity, when the refining of the salt process was completed. But nevertheless, potash was included in the proposal to declare toxicity on road salt. The need for a science assessment probably is viewed as a process to establish federal jurisdiction in order to regulate a substance. The assessment process in the case of salt and ammonia did not add any scientific knowledge to the equation. When a science assessment is used in legislation as a measure to define constitutionality, then we end up with the difficulties of whether or not you can, remove the word toxic from SEPA and still have legislation that is constitutional. This politicizes the science assessment and effectively destroys its validity as an effective tool for decision making. The only way, if the only way that you can establish jurisdiction is to declare something toxic, then every word in the science assessment that's going to be written down is going to be one that intends to drive the decision in that particular direction. Whether or not the assessment is meaningful in any peer-reviewed science meaning of the word is effectively becomes irrelevant. We had weak science assessments for road salt and ammonia in the aquatic environment because of the politicized process. Early on, CFI did a literature review on the ammonia issue and showed the science assessors what everybody in the world already knew, that if you put excessive quantities of ammonia in water, it will kill fish. It's also a life-giving substance that is absolutely essential to make plants grow. And it's an issue not of inherent toxicity, but one in which a certain quantity is necessary for life and very beneficial, and too much can cause harm to certain species. I would like to conclude my brief comments by suggesting that the one thing the science assessment does not do is to ask what a meaningful risk management for a substance would be. Rather than focusing efforts on risk assessments or on risk management, we spend years politically fighting over what the risk assessment should say on a substance. This is a huge misallocation of public resources within the Department of the Environment. It's a huge waste of economic resources on the part of the affected industries, and is detrimental, in my view, to effective public policy development. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Mr. Godfrey.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Today we're looking at these three issues: information requirements, burden of proof, and disclosure. And I suppose the challenge is to try and get out from the witnesses, in terms of the existing Act, if we look at these three issues, do we think that SEPA has been too harsh, just about right, or not strong enough? I would have some difficulty relating that question to Mr. Larson's presentation, but perhaps he can help in the question I'm now about to put. I would read into what Ms. Coombs said, that as far as these three issues are concerned, SEPA is strong enough, that the minister has the power, and that basically, if I understood correctly, Ms. Coombs was arguing for the maintenance of the status quo. Ms. Ginsburg, and unfortunately, Ms. Ginsburg, we didn't have all of your comments translated in either official language, so we had to listen very carefully what you had to say. I would gather that on all three of these issues, that you felt we should go further. If that would be the layman's summary of what you said in a fairly dense 10 minutes. So I guess my question now comes, since we've eliminated that it's been too strong. My question is to Ms. Coombs, having heard Ms. Ginsburg give her critique on these 3 points of information requirement, burden of proof, and disclosure, which of those points would you have argument with? Realizing that you can't have argument with all of them because we haven't got enough time. So if you were to pick your top line criticisms, and then we'll have Ms. Ginsburg come back, or perhaps Dr. Capel.
Well, actually, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I was intrigued by some of the comments that were provided, because while you may have summarized that, yes, we are supportive of the status quo, we are supportive of a science-based, rigorous system when it comes to new substance notifications. So we're very pleased with how that process works, as it is predictable and rigorous. And we're pleased that it also works for substances and Food and Drug Act products. I think I was a little bit surprised about the comments with respect to confidentiality, and I didn't understand some of the concerns, and I would put that forward as something that maybe we could further explore, since CCSPA believes that the powers within SEPA provide provisions to protect confidential test data, but also to provide information to people who wish to ask for that information, and that's through the Access to Information Act. And because it's my understanding that if a notifier makes a submission to the department and designates everything as confidential test information or confidential business information, that there's still pieces within that that can be accessible through ATI, the Access to Information. So.
Would that be your only criticism of what Ms. Ginsburg had to say? In other words, she was, I don't mean to, she was suggesting that we needed a much more proactive regime. I'm thinking of, for example, on burden of proof. She was suggesting that we look more to what the Europeans are doing, and that this is the time to realign our legislation with the most forward-looking jurisdictions in the world. Did you see any difficulty with that?
As I mentioned in my comments, that our member companies do in-house testing and rigorous risk assessments prior to those substances coming in into Canada, and as well with respect to the government. I mean, they set out the criteria and the parameters for how the science and the information should be compiled and submitted to them prior to any decisions being made. So we think that, you know, there are the provisions in place to ensure that substances that are beneficial to consumers are brought into the marketplace without harming human health and the environment.
But Ms. Ginsburg was arguing that we needed stronger authority to use the precautionary principle to ban or significantly reduce the most dangerous substances. In other words, she, in her testimony, said that she felt that SEPA was inadequate. And so I would
May I
wonder...
clarify, is that for new or existing substances?
Hmm?
Is that for new or existing substances?
Ms. Ginsburg?
Could I respond?
Sure, of course.
The comments around burden of proof were directed to both existing and new.
Okay, so your argument is that industry is not providing enough data for new substances and existing substances. Is that?
There's a number of areas of existing and new substances which I think could bear improvement. Certainly, the onus on industry to provide data for new substances is an improvement over essentially the non-requirement which existed originally for the existing substances. So there is a data set there. However, there are certainly areas that the data set could be improved, such as especially around chronic toxicity, children's health issues. There's a number of rooms for improvement. And in terms of the government's authority under those two areas, one of the reasons that I know that it's still an issue under the new substances regime as well as the existing, 7 years ago, or approximately 7 years ago, I was involved in the multi-stakeholder consultation, which extended for around 2 years, which looked at revising new substances notification regulations for chemicals and polymers. And one of the major issues we dealt with was Section 84(1)(c), which was government's ability to augment the existing data set with additional pieces of data where they felt it was required. So there are these core data requirements in the regulations themselves, sometimes based on the information to come from those core data requirements. Government feels like there needs to be additional tests performed. However, under 84(1)(c), its authority to require those additional tests is constrained by this suspicion of toxicity threshold, essentially. And there was a fundamental lack of understanding about what that was. It's not defined. Different people within government can interpret it different ways, but essentially it creates this unspoken pressure to essentially already determine the substance to be toxic in order to request further information. So it's a bit of a catch-22. We tried at that time to explore ways that that language could be clarified, perhaps through guidance manuals, but it was decided the ultimate goal was that there needed to be some clarification in SEPA itself. It's unclear language. And in fact, we feel that that caveat, that suspicion of toxicity requirement should just be taken out so that when government does feel like it needs additional data to make its assessment, it should have the authority to do so. And that same language appears for both existing and new substances. And I think my colleague Capil also had something quick to add.
Mr. Chair, is it okay if I take
Sure.
more of Mr. Godfrey's time on this? I'd like to at some point be able to do the international comparison, but just to do the domestic comparison to the Pesticide Act, what we have in terms of comparing it to the existing substances and to the new substances is that the Pesticide Act requires quite a bit more information and requires testing data on every substance, every pesticide that's on the market. And I think one of the witnesses came before the committee, explained before that it's this weird thing where companies that both make chemicals that are not pesticides and chemicals that are pesticides, on the pesticide when they have to do all this, create all this data, and on the other side they don't. So on the one hand, we feel that the information requirements, particularly for existing substances where there are no information requirements, and that they're weak for new substances, for the new substances as well. But in addition to that, the Pesticide Act, the new Pesticide Act now sets a different standard for confidentiality. It divides business confidential information from the test data that's related to health and environment. The test data is now public. You can go to the Pest Management Regulatory Agency and you can look at all that data. It's public information now, and we believe that that should be true for chemicals that fall under SEPA as well.
Much time left. Mr. Arsenault, as you hear these suggestions, do you think that the effectiveness of SEPA would be improved by what Ms. Ginsberg and Dr. Catter are saying?
Perhaps I should explain a little bit about how that piece of the how that part of the Act gets operationalized within the new substances program. It happens whenever a risk assessor believes that there is a reason for concern that isn't really addressed adequately by the test information that has been received or the adequacy of our predictive models. We would then go back to a company and require different types of testing and more information in order to be able to make a determination. We've always viewed that piece of the legislation not so much as an invitation to conduct ongoing research as much as to address a particular concern that we are becoming aware of, usually because of emerging science such as areas like perfluorinated compounds, which only became of concern recently because of information coming to us. We've gone out and asked for more information in the context of those, for example. So that's how we tend to apply it. If we were to apply that in a broader context, I'm not sure we would know exactly what to ask for that would actually help us make a determination. Thank you.
Our time is up. Just very briefly, you wanted to get in.
Thanks. I just wanted to attempt to address Mr. Godfrey's question. I think that SEPA is much less effective than it could be because it causes a misdirection of resources. As I mentioned, it doesn't ask what meaningful risk management would be. It spends its time basically politicizing the issue, while something like a pesticide, if we understand the Latin root of the word, is icide, which is to kill. Obviously, you're going to have a toxicity question, but there are many substances that need to be managed that do not properly fit into that category, and resources are misspent. Thank you.
Mr. Lucier.
Oui, en continuité, Monsieur Larson.
Yes, following through, Mr. Carson. You're saying that we give too much significance or too much weight to risk assessment and not enough to risk management. Is that right? Can you expand on that, would you please? Risk management, what do you mean by that?
Risk management to us is managing the impact that substances, that products can have in their normal use in the environment, and to manage the potential for misuse in inappropriate areas. by educating users on things like best management practices. CFI has developed a very comprehensive science-based program for certified crop advisors to advise farmers on how to properly manage nutrients, whether they're fertilizer nutrients or manure sources or other organic sources, and to ensure that there is a balance between the nutrients that are applied in the field equate to the nutrients that are removed in the growing crop. These best management principles are much more effective at helping, say, 240,000 farmers in Canada manage nutrients appropriately than some concept of hiring EnviroCops to follow along and try to tell these farmers how to operate, which we all know would be completely ineffective, and Environment Canada couldn't possibly manage the resources to do that. So instead of spending our time on political debates, small p political debates, I might add, as to whether or not a substance should be labeled in a particular way. We would be much more effective if we looked at what programs can be used in part of the normal economy. I have a publication I'd be pleased to share with you, and while I only speak English, it is in both English and French, on best management practices for fertilizer. I'd be very pleased to share this with you. Thank you.
Même chose pour la question de l'étude qui a été faite sur...
Now, the same applies to the question on the study that was done on road salts. Was it part of your mandate to propose alternates or substitutes for road salt?
It was. I was not the lead organization in that issue. We worked with a number of different organizations, and of course the Association of Municipalities, which put forward a code of practice that they developed themselves and put forward for best management practices for salting. And it's an excellent example of the kind of cooperative best management practices that can be put together between industry and users, in this case urban municipalities, and with the participation of government in an appropriate way, without the inappropriate and overly forceful regulation or legislation.
Mais tous les produits substituts pour remplacer les sels.
But of all these alternate products which might substitute for road salt, should also be tested to assess and see that they're not toxic, for example.
I would first suggest that road salt's not toxic either, but it can be harmful to, for example, a row of apple trees beside the roadway. It can affect the certain species of grass in the ditches, and that is a negative result. There never was an assessment done on potassium chloride, which is potash. As I mentioned, when we mine potash, it's roughly 40% sodium chloride and 60% potassium chloride. When we separate it out, there's generally a little bit of potassium chloride that ends up with the salt. So if you use that salt on the roads, there's a little bit of potassium chloride in it. Whether or not that potassium chloride presents the same kinds of issues or not was never assessed. I think there was some, and yes, there is some validity in the science saying, okay, is this alternative better than sodium chloride for the environment? But I think the first step is to see whether or not, with good management practices, that we can't manage sodium chloride, which is the most cost-effective way of maintaining ice-free roads. Before we start looking at, if sodium chloride is $10 a ton and another alternative is $150 a ton, the first thing to do is to better manage the sodium chloride before you increase people's taxes that much.
Thank you.
Wants to get in a comment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just one point of clarification. The risk assessment on road salts treated road salts as a kind of a mixture, understanding that there were different chloride compounds included in the product, and did an assessment on that whole mixture, which of course did include potassium chloride. And it was a very thorough science-based assessment, peer-reviewed, internationally leading, and the main issue it addressed was whether the amounts used were causing concentrations sufficient in the environment to have adverse effects. And it did come to a conclusion on that.
Mr. Lucier.
J'aimerais revenir à Madame Carl.
I would also have a question of our other witness. You spoke of a government communications program. I didn't quite grasp if that was Health Canada or Environment Canada, which was being targeted by your comments, but what information do you believe should be included in such a communication program? You're saying that we mustn't frighten Canadians, etc., on the domestic substances list, but what information should be contained then?
Question. The CSDSL program, as I have commented in our opening remarks, is leading the world with how existing substances are being managed. And it is our assertion that there needs to be a communication strategy to Canadians to inform them about the process that the government undertook for the categorization process, the science behind that program, and the results of that program. So there's approximately 4,000 substances that are going to be on that list that have met the criteria in some way, and that needs to be properly explained. And there's going to be substances on that list that are beneficial to Canadians, like vitamin A and tamoxifen if you are a cancer patient with a particular type of cancer. Titanium oxide is another example that we had, is an ingredient in sunscreen. And what we're asking is that it be put into perspective about what's on the list. And first you have to go back to what's on the DSL, which is a huge range of substances that we had discussed earlier in my presentation as well. So we're looking for something that clearly articulates what the program has been, science-based, where we're going with respect to the results and next steps, and to explain to Canadians what's on the list, because, as I mentioned, there is food and it is both departments, to answer your first question. Sure.
Where I believe you want to get in.
Actually, that's what I want to say. Je voudrais répondre que c'est les deux ministères qui sont ciblés.
In fact, I'd like to answer or add to that, please. It's both the federal departments are targeted to prepare such a communication plan and strategy, both Health Canada and Environment Canada. Thank you.
That underlie the questions that have been asked relate to the right of Canadians to a healthy environment and the right of Canadians to have their government protect their health and their environment. And I was reading this weekend, the major newspaper published a whole section on the rise in cancer amongst Canadians, where I think the statement was that 2 out of 5 Canadians can expect to have cancer. So, and there was a reference to that being perhaps reflecting a failure in public policy. So, coming back to what we're talking about today, to CEPA, would you like to comment on that as it relates to CEPA? Has there been a tendency to protect industry at the expense of protecting citizens?
Thanks very much for the question. I mean, the difficult answer for a lot of questions around rising rates of cancer and other diseases is that we often don't know. And that's particularly the reason why we have sessions like this where we talk about the need for information. When we have such a large number of substances that have been grandfathered and are on the market without any data or evidence for either their safety or their harm, we just can't answer the question as to whether those substances are part of the problem or not. We know there's a problem. The problem is unexplained. We know there are all these chemicals that we have very little information about, and we need to be able to put those two things together.
And hence, I guess your suggestion that we should err on the side of precaution and use the precautionary principle. Can you elaborate a little bit on how the precautionary principle would apply in a practical way in the assessment of the reassessment of these products and I guess the assessment of new products?
If I could speak to that. The precautionary principle, one of the most direct ways that it could apply is that there are a lot of substances, hundreds of substances, which there is very, very little to no information about them. And when that's the case, and these, now I'm referring to the existing substances, so those that have been going through this categorization exercise where government is trying to pull together whatever existing information there is about these substances, looking at to see whether they pose a threat. When there's not the information available on which to base a decision, the precautionary principle could kick in and say that these substances need to be controlled, limited, prohibited, eliminated, or alternatively, another way that the precautionary principle could be used is to say that until information is provided demonstrating the safety of these substances, that they should not be used any further, or that risk management measures should be taken to eliminate them. So this is when there's not that information available, that instead of just saying, well, we don't know, therefore we're not going to do anything, which is essentially what the current approach has been, that if there's not that information to support the indication of toxicity, the suspicion of toxicity, that there's not action taken.
Let's just try to briefly answer your questions. With respect to the cancer question that you had asked, I think that it's important to recognize that our whole world is made up of chemicals, and you know, everything we eat and we touch and we breathe are chemicals, and most of those are natural. I think, for example, there's 17 carcinogens in a cup of coffee, and but it's not the dose, or it's not the chemical, it's the dose that we need to take into consideration. With respect to the comments that you raised, our statistics that we have from the Canadian Cancer Society. I'm sorry?
We're just, people are abandoning their coffee en masse here.
I'm sorry to cause alarm. My apologies. But the statistics that we have from the Cancer Society is that the new cases of cancer is primarily due to an increasing and aging population, and the 43% of new cancer cases and 60% of deaths due to cancer occur among those who are at least 70 years of age. So we need to also put that into perspective as we think about substances. And then with respect to the precautionary principle, I believe that the precautionary principle is embedded in the new science, in the new substance notification regulations. And I also believe that the precautionary principle will be embedded in the risk assessments that will be done during the screening of the categorization and the screening of the domestic substances program.
Mr. Larson.
Before you can sell a fertilizer in Canada, you have to register it with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. In order to do that, in order to win that registration, you have to not only prove that the product is safe, but you also have to prove that the product is beneficial. So I think the choice that you gave us is not always, in your example, is not always the real choice that we're facing. Quite often you have something that is very beneficial and is also very good for the health of Canadians, but nevertheless is a substance.
I have another question that relates to a comment that Mr. Larson made regarding the word toxic. And I'm wondering if, Ms. Ginsburg, if you could talk about that question with respect to, I believe there's been a court challenge on that issue already. I believe that he suggested that it simply politicized the issue rather than addressed anything substantive. Can you comment on?
try to answer that question. We've spoken a little bit about toxic 4 in terms of, I think you're making reference to, I think the question is making reference to the Hydro-Quebec case in particular, and other cases where the question of whether CEPA was constitutional in terms of its federal authority to deal with these substances, partially at least, if not fully, hinged on the fact that the criminal law idea that these substances were toxic and harmful. And what we are concerned about, if we tamper with the list as it is in the term toxic, that we may raise the possibility of a challenge to that constitutionality.
And I guess my last question, Canada seems to be thought of by various groups to have weaker laws with respect to products than do, for example, some OECD countries. Would you agree with that, or would you comment on that? Just reading the Suzuki Foundation on the food we eat, they've commented that Canada seems to have one of the weakest regulations around some of these substances.
Just briefly, no, I wouldn't agree with that statement. That, as we mentioned in our brief, the new substance notifications provide a science-based, predictable, rigorous system for new substances being introduced into Canada. And then with respect to existing substances, the categorization process is leading the world in how existing substances are being assessed and managed.
Mr. Catter?
Just to note that, I mean, what we need to remember in terms of timelines is that the new European legislation REACH is not just coming, but it's basically here. The vote is on December 12th. Everyone anticipates that it will be passed, and implementation will start in the new year. And what that will mean is for the highest volume substances, within 3 years, we'll have data sets for all of them. And by the time the CEPA review is finished and we have this revision to CEPA, if we haven't kept up in terms of requiring data sets for existing substances and for following the European lead, as it's the largest chemicals market, in terms of the transparency and of that health and safety data, we're going to be a couple of steps behind. So although it's true that at the moment our new substances notification program is a world leader, that we will quickly fall behind if we do not continue to progress.
Mr. Larson, did you have a comment?
I would just say that we have I would argue that we have the highest standards in the world for the registration of our products, and I think that is one of the reasons why we find it so troublesome to be debating, the attachment of labels to our products. And I would just like to note for Mr. Arsenault's benefit, because he knows I want to get the last word in, that they never did assess potassium chloride. They know they didn't assess it. If it was such a very high standard, peer-reviewed, internationally renowned study, I'd like to see the data that shows that potassium chloride should be treated the same as sodium chloride.
Mr. Arsenault,
because
I
it
believe you
almost
have
cost us a
challenge.
500,000-ton market in Japan.
Mr. Arsenault.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My point was that it was assessed as a mixture. We didn't do sodium chloride or potassium chloride as unique constituents of that mixture, but assessed the mixture of road salts themselves, of which potassium chloride is a small part.
Thank you for that clarification. Mr. Warwa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be sharing my 10 minutes with Mr. Harvey, and I'd like to focus on burden of proof, but I would first like to start off with addressing some of the comments that were made by the witnesses. Thank you for being here today. This is relevant in that C30, the Clean Air Act, proposes amendments to support third-party auditing of information before submission, therefore enhancing the authority for the Minister of the Environment to utilize this information for the purpose of maintaining a national pollutant release inventory, NPRI, with a reliable baseline level of information on releases of substances. And it also proposes to extend the current authorities under Section 71 of CEPA 99 to the Minister of Health in order to improve the efficiency of using these authorities. These authorities allow for the collecting of information and the requirement to conduct tests in order to determine if a substance is toxic or capable of becoming toxic. So I think that's good, very good news. Question regarding the burden of proof. I'd like to hear some discussion, and I'd ask you to keep your answers short. Regarding the burden of proof, which is the more effective, to have industry or the government, where should the burden of proof lie? Which is the more cautious period, and what are the pros and cons of each method? If you could comment on there. Ms. Combs has shared that you believe it's a shared responsibility between industry and the government, and I believe Ms. Ginsburg has said that industry should be responsible to demonstrate the safety of the substance first. So if we could have from all members of the witnesses to provide your comments on the pros and cons of both and what your recommendation is.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I had stated in our opening remarks, that first and foremost, our number one priority is the health and safety of Canadians and their environment. Our member companies provide products that are beneficial to consumers, soaps, detergents, ant traps, as well as disinfectants, so cleaning tabletops. These are the types of products that our members provide and are beneficial to consumers. And our industry, they're constantly trying to find ways to bring technology to Canada. And we also want to make sure that those products are the ingredients in those products are safe and have no harm to the environment. And our member companies conduct numerous in-house tests and assessments to ensure that the substances in those products can be used safely and human health and the environment are not compromised. But in order to bring that technology to Canada, we have to meet the rigors of the system that's in place. And the government sets the tone for what regulations are there to be met, what science we have to provide, what information we have to provide, and they make the final determination. Hence the reason why our submission is that we believe that it's a joint responsibility. But at the end of the day, it is the government that makes the final decision with respect to bringing new substances into Canada. And they also have a say in how existing substances are on the DSL as well. That, there's still that level of protection there where the government will say, no, that substance needs to be taken off the DSL because for reason X, Y, and Z.
Thank you. In order to speak to the pros and cons, I think we have only to look at what the historical situation has been and also the direction that other countries, such as the European countries, are moving in. We've seen through the priority substance list exercise that it is very near unworkable for government to continue carrying as much of the burden as it has. It's incredibly slow. It's very expensive. Industry works with these substances. It knows the substances. It is able to provide this information when required to. Sometimes it does mean going out and investigating further, conducting further tests. But as long as government continues to bear this burden, there's actually a disincentive for industry to get to know its own substances better. I mean, as Ms. Combs says, if they do have that sort of information at their disposal, it will not be a heavy onus for them to simply provide it to government. Government will always and should always play a role in terms of regulating these substances. I think it would be problematic to remove government from the equation altogether, but in terms of providing the information, again, it is industry who benefits financially. Currently, it's the taxpayers of this country who are paying for a lot of this assessment, and there's not the direct financial gain for them as well.
But I appreciate sharing my time. There's only 5 minutes left, so thank you for your comments. Mr. Harvey.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for being here. As my colleague has said, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act is a very important law, of course. I'm very pleased to see that we have the support of the NDP over the past few weeks so that we can continue to work on CEPA. Had it not, otherwise we would not have been in a position to update and deal with this for at least another year. So I'm very glad to see that we're moving forward on this file. A lot has been said about road salts, or various salts that are used for clearing ice off of roadways. I remember a problem a couple of years ago where a family was, well, they were completely crushed under a truck, and there was a roadway alongside a river. And because of the presence of the waterway, calcium couldn't be used on the roads. Essentially, the vehicle was traveling along a wet surface, and all of a sudden it was pure ice. There was an accident. So we're trying to find a balance today, a balance which will ensure that the use of any chemical substance is not there to destroy or contribute to the destruction or loss of life, but in fact to improve the quality of life. Finding that balance is often a tricky issue, and this is why you are here today, to help us in that decision. Mr. Larson, you said that we were politicizing the situation here. So I would like to have you expand on that a little bit, please. I'm a new MP, and I'd like to know as much as possible. We're trying to deal in a least partisan way possible and to come up with solid, concrete results for the ordinary Canadian. Mr. Larson, could you expand on that, please?
When you take a word like toxic, it has a tremendous emotional impact on consumers, on the general public, on legislators, on courts, and on customers. And you make it the end goal of a science assessment, then the entire debate will be around proving whether or not that substance is toxic or not. Now toxic has a meaning, and I'm not a linguist and I'm not a lawyer, but toxic has a meaning in the ordinary sense of the word, that just about every citizen will have in their mind when they hear the word toxic. You know, it's poison. It's, you know, don't touch this. It's bad. It's ban it. And there are many substances, and you know, salt being one of them, ammonia another, that are absolutely essential for life, and yet they have externalities. They have situations where they need to be managed, and the application of salt to roads for de-icing is one where I think most reasonable people would say, yes, we need to come up with some management protocols so we can balance the benefits with the potential negative outcomes and come up with the optimal solution. And that's what we call a risk management situation, is where everyone sits down and they do the best that they can to define what appropriate risk management is. They use science to guide them, and they use practicality, and they use the real life issues as to whether or not you're going to use a $10 product or a $100 substitute, and what is the cost-benefit ratio. But all of the meaningful discussions around mismanagement get taken away because we spent 5 years debating whether or not you could call salt toxic, and you know, it just amazes me that we would spend so much political effort. Now, many lawyers said you have to do this because of the constitutional question as to who has jurisdiction. If you don't label it toxic, then there may not be federal jurisdiction. The unfortunate outcome of the jurisdictional debate as to what was required for jurisdiction meant that, for example, like my own industry, we're an export industry. We export 75% of our production. And in the case of potash, we export 95% of it. We almost lost one of our largest offshore markets, Japan, because when the Japanese government took a look at our exports of potash, and they said, but your government is declaring potassium chloride toxic. Therefore, you know, our holistic, organic food production system, we can't allow this substance to be used in our agriculture, and we almost lost that market. These are the consequences of trying to stick an inappropriate label on products, on substances, and this is where the situation ends up when we don't focus on risk management. I'm sorry, very long-winded.
Thank you, Mr. Harvey. I'd like the committee's permission for Mr. Godfrey to take over as I need to leave early, and then we'll go to Mr. Wilson. Any problems?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for your testimony. I think listening to what you had to say, we can all agree that the government has a role to play and has a large obligation through the Canadian Environmental Protection Act to ensure that Canadians and their environment are properly protected from the harmful effects of toxic substances. We've discussed the three main topics on information requirement, disclosure, and burden of proof. The first question I have is to the Director Generals of the Department of Health and the Department of the Environment. It's my understanding that through the domestic substance list, some 23,000 substances have been analyzed over the last 7 years. Is that correct? What has the cost been to the federal government to analyze those 23,000 substances?
I'm afraid we don't have exact figures here today, but the kind of resources that we've applied in my program to conduct that research have included a team of about a dozen individuals and also the development of computer analysis tools in conjunction with Canadian academia and industry. So I would have to do a rough calculation on the overall cost of that.
Just a rough estimate, ballpark, over 7 years.
I could get back to you on that very quickly.
And the Department of the Environment?
That was the Department of Health.
Yes, sir.
The answer is ditto.
Suffice it to say that it's probably a fairly considerably high number if you take it over 7 years and 23,000 substances. If you could get back to me on that, I would be very much interested. The follow-up question is there's 4,000 substances now to be analyzed, and the department working in tandem together is going to be analyzing that. What's your estimate of what the cost is going to be to the federal government to analyze those 4,000 substances?
That is a matter that we are still discussing with the ministers at this point in time as they consider how to respond to that. So it's still an item that is up for some debate internally between the department and the minister's office about what the appropriate response is as they come forward with their plan.
Well, I think, I'm not speaking for industry, but I'm sure that the industry in Canada is happy that the federal government has taken it upon themselves to assume this role and responsibility to keep Canadians safe, and that through the taxes that the corporations pay to the government, this tax money is being used to safeguard Canadians and to do the due diligence and review of the substances. The question I always have is if we talk about burden of proof, but we talk about responsibility and who's going to start paying for the future review of these substances, what's industry's viewpoint on that?
Sorry, industry has been actively involved the past 6 years, so it's not just a cost to the government to undertake this initiative, it's also a cost to our member companies and other industry associations and their member companies as well, because we want to make sure that we have the appropriate people at the table, and we will have the appropriate scientists at the table, and that all of our members are engaged, because it has been an effort by all of our member companies and other association member companies to actively participate in that. And there's a cost attached to ensuring that you're proactive and providing the right information at the right time to the departments. And we see the future as being the same way, that as we move forward, there will also be a cost incurred by our companies to move forward and to proactively provide this information as well.
What would the effect be on industry if the burden of proof shifted, and that prior to any substances being put out into the communities, the industry would have to prove that the substances that they are releasing are safe? If the burden of proof shifted, are we talking a significant economic cost?
Well, I find it's an interesting argument, because I think that we already have this like a reverse onus. Industry has to provide information set, a data set to the government to be reviewed. So we are providing that data and that information and the tests to support substances being new into the market and also continued into the market. So I think the burden of proof is on us to provide that, and then ultimately the decision is made by the government to say yes, that data does meet the requirements, and yes, we will allow that substance in, or yes, we will continue that substance to be allowed.
Ms. Ginsburg, do you have a comment? Well, I was thinking Dr. Katter, which one of you two wanted to respond?
I think we'd be very happy to have it established in SEPA, the idea that the burden of proof is on industry. I think the reality right now for existing substances is it's not, and it really is a reasonable person test. I think the Canadian public, when they buy a product and want to be able to ask, if they could ask the manufacturer, is this product that I'm buying from you, are all the substances in it and all the chemicals, are they safe enough for me if I use this as directed? And they would expect that the answer would be yes. And when it comes to the existing substances that have no data and have no data that's been submitted for government, the answer is simply, we don't know. And I don't think the Canadian public expects the government to be chasing after each and every product and chemical and policing this, while those that are putting these substances on the market and chemicals aren't taking the responsibility for ensuring that what they are putting into the market is safe enough for use.
Thank you, Dr. Katter. Mr. Vellacott.
There already came a couple questions around the issues of confidentiality prior, and I guess maybe our department people can respond on this as well. But apparently mask names may be used to hide some of that confidential information regarding a substance, in quotes, where the publication of the explicit chemical or biological name of a substance would result in the release of confidential business information. So I guess I'm curious, I don't know what the sense of the industry members are in terms of that particular possibility, and whether they get faced with it some, and I guess particularly how often have those mask name regulations been used and for what types of compounds? So I don't know where to start. Shannon, want to start?
She's asked me to actually provide a little bit of background information on the use of mask names in the context of the New Substances Program. Very often when a notifier is bringing forward a chemical for assessment and review and entry into the market, there is a commercial context with respect to that entry, and therefore they request a masking of the name on the DSL. We do assess and control the chemical exactly the same as we would with any others. We receive about 3,000 of those, or have received about 3,000 of those requests over the life of the program. We've refused that just under 500 times for the purposes of actually notifying the public and consumers of that chemical of any requirement that we would have imposed with respect to either notification for more data if there was a change in use or if there were conditions imposed. We, of course, reveal the name of that chemical. But generally, like other OECD countries with similar programs, we will allow for the commercial confidentiality if there is no adverse public interest effect.
Okay. I don't know if Dr. Katter or any others want to respond to that?
That was a very good answer.
It was a good answer? Okay. Jessica?
I would just make one additional point in that I think there's another process that I was involved with involves the new substances notification regulations involving organisms, which are essentially biotechnology products. And in the context of that process, I tried very hard as a concerned member of the public to find out what the protocols were with respect to claiming confidentiality for biotechnology products, which, as you have probably been aware, are a huge concern of the public. It's a very hot topic right now in terms of politics, how biotech products are dealt with. And the response that I was given was that despite the fact that there are guidelines around how the department and how notifiers shall both deal with confidential information, that the de facto operating policy of the department was just to treat all of the information as confidential unless they received a written consent. Now, I asked 3 different people and I received 3 different answers. That seemed to be the consensus in the end. But there's obviously, from my perspective, some confusion, which is part of the reason why we feel like the test to be met in order to claim confidentiality should be part of the legislative language and not just part of the guidance.
Okay. I guess another question there. It's fairly widely accepted that sharing of information obtained in other jurisdictions can help us speed it up, facilitate some risk assessment then. How is that issue of confidentiality handled with respect to international sharing of information? And secondly, do confidentiality issues hinder the transfer of information, and how can that be how can that problem be addressed?
I suppose I should try to respond to that as well. Thank you very much for the question. Commercial confidentiality concerns do indeed have a huge impact with respect to the useful exchange of information internationally among regulatory agencies, and we try to overcome that problem by entering into confidential information exchange agreements with other jurisdictions. For example, when REACH is finally adopted, it contains a clause that mirrors a clause in CEPA that allows for the confidential exchange of information. And we also have a useful arrangement with Australia already in place. There are some difficulties with respect to the United States because of the way that the confidentiality arrangements are written into TSCA. There are some impediments there, but we've tried to overcome them through something called the Four Corners Arrangement, which includes the chemical companies themselves waiving confidentiality requirements to be able to share data with both agencies at the same time. So we're constantly trying to do that, but there are some legal impediments that are there.
Thank you, Mr. Arsenault. Monsieur Lucier.
Oui, en continuité avec la question de la
Yes, following through on this issue of confidentiality, the question that I'd like to deal with is the refusal to maintain certain records. What recourse might there be? Is there a right of appeal if there's a refusal to protect or keep confidence of information?
Et puis après, le Dr. Cather.
Okay. Yes, and then Dr. Cather, please.
Thank you very much for the question. The acceptance or refusal of a confidentiality request is a reviewable decision on the part of the minister and the exercise of the minister's discretion. Mm-hmm. Therefore, there is communication between the government and the company claiming confidentiality, an exploration of as much as possible what can be released that is not necessarily commercially confidential within the guidelines that we use, and then the ministers make a decision. And the companies involved have a period within which they can choose to appeal that decision through the judicial system.
You were trying to piggyback on the previous one, and I'm not sure if what you were going to say ties in. Sorry, it was Ms. Ginsburg, right.
I was just going to reiterate what Mr. Arsenault said, and also highlight the fact that, yes, there is an appeal provision for companies who feel like their information should have been kept confidential, but there's no comparable provision allowing appeals for the public or other interested parties who feel like the information should be disclosed, at least not in the text of the Act.
Mais la question, je vais aller plus loin, les documents.
Let me flesh out my question a little bit. Documents would be tabled, or information would be tabled with the Department of Health, probably. They have technical information on each of these products or substances. Now, if a case should arise where someone would ingest the product, And what's a doctor to do? Are they to consult with the Department of Health if they need that information to treat a patient? What would happen? Is it quick? Does it take a lot of time? Does it take 2 weeks? Or well, in the law there are provisions. There are provisions for one or the other of the two ministers to provide the information if necessary to assist someone, a doctor, for example. It is a provision of the law itself where the minister may provide the information. No, but what's to say it is a doctor calling and not a competitor pretending to be a doctor? In order to invoke this provision, the individual has to rationalize and justify the request. Not because they want the information, they must have a reason, a justification for needing the information. Okay, thank you. There's currently a bill in the Senate on the WHMIS system, hazardous materials at work, WHMIS. So the whole issue of confidentiality and disclosure is being changed on that. Are you aware of that bill, by the way? No, I'm afraid I'm not aware of the bill, no. Well, there you are. I've just advised you of that bill. The confidentiality relating to products being used, hazardous materials used in the workplace, have been softened up prior to this recommended change. They had to provide a whole battery of information, and there was several safeguards, a whole set of safeguards on that non-disclosure of that information. But that's being changed. So you see, they can be useful from time to time. No further questions, Mr. Speaker.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much to our witnesses here today. I appreciate you coming, and I'm just going to follow up on what my colleague here was questioning about. I don't think there was an adequate time, so I don't know if the panel remembers or not, but I would kind of like to go back to the issues of confidentiality, because it's very important to me that we maintain the ability of industries and corporations or whoever to be able to compete and to be able to keep trade secrets and those kinds of things, and balance that with the public's right to know what's going on in the environment. And I just want to give the witnesses an opportunity to, because I don't think if I'm reading that correctly, I don't think everybody had an opportunity to respond to my colleague's questions. So how, as far as confidentiality handled with respect to international sharing of information, we talked about REACH, and I don't think that that's been adequately thought out or addressed yet, and I just wondered if I could get your feedback on that. And do confidentiality issues hinder transfer of information? How can this problem be addressed? So if we could just revisit those questions, I'd be interested in what you had to say.
Mr. Larson, everybody's very keen on this one.
Sorry, Mr. Godfrey. Well, the reason I didn't speak up before is because my industry does not produce patented products. We produce scientifically generic products. So the confidentiality issues are pretty much in the niche of specialty products and that. But I will address your comments on REACH if I can very briefly. Because we have generic products, we have been working as an industry on a product testing program for the last several years, both in North America and in Europe. And we believe that our products are going to be, all the analysis and information that we have on our products will be sufficient to meet European REACH if or when that program is approved by the European Parliament. Thank you.
Ms. Coombs?
If I could just give a very, sorry. No, it's okay. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just quickly with your comments with respect to confidentiality, I think that in our brief we outlined what we felt were adequate provisions in CEPA, and I know that the comparison was put forward with respect to the Pest Control Products Act and the differences in that. And I think that information is available to people who request it. It's just a matter of how you go about it. Through the Pest Control Products Act, there'll be a provision where you can access that information via a reading room if you make an application to do so.
through SEPA. I believe you make a request under the Access to Information, and you just, so it's, the acts work in the same way, it's just a different way to go about how you go about getting the information. And then with respect to REACH, I think that REACH and the CSDSL program are basically trying to address the same issue, and that is building public confidence in how existing substances are managed. And it's CCSPA's position that we're a decade ahead of REACH with respect to how existing substances are being managed, and we think that with the science-based program and a consultation process built into that with respect to due process for companies to respond to is the way to go. It's practical, and it's workable.
Ms. Ginsburg.
If I could just take a few seconds for myself and then have permission to pass it to Dr. Katter. I just wanted to very quickly point out that not all pieces of legislation use the same test for maintaining confidentiality. For example, the Access to Information Act does not have a clause in Section 15 of SEPA which refers to the damage to the privacy, reputation, or human dignity. A different test is used in the Access to Information. And also, I would point to the international trend, which is moving away from confidentiality for chemical issues relating to health and safety of humans and the environment. And if I could just pass it very quickly to Dr. Katter.
Well, Mr. Chair, my 10 seconds would just be that there is a difference between trade secrets and health and safety data, that the world is moving towards recognizing that difference and that making health and safety data public and transparent. SEPA does a terrible job of that, and as REACH is coming, if we're going to be sharing information, we need to be harmonized with other jurisdictions in terms of how we deal with health and safety data. And in fact, we just agreed to the strategic approach to international chemicals management agreement with 160 other countries, and in there it says that health and safety data around health and it should not be considered confidential.
Okay.
About a glorious 12 seconds.
Thank you very much for your answers.
You're welcome. Ms. Savoie.
Merci.
Oui,
Avant de poser ma question, je voulais revenir à un commentaire.
Before asking my question, I'm referring back to Mr. Hervé, that there was a pact with the devil here, that the NDP believes that the law should be completely gutted and started over again. But this being said, there is no devil's agreement here. But I do have a few questions here.
I believe that since industry is already providing information, the information required on health and safety and so on, then I assume that if the onus were officially placed in the Act on industry, it wouldn't be more onerous.
Well,
I believe I understood your comment were that you're already doing this.
We're already doing it,
so
yes. So
placing it in the Act should not be more onerous.
I think it's implicit in the Act. It's because it's in the regulations.
Okay, thank you. And I guess I have a question that perhaps Mr. Arsenault or Glover can respond to. Is there, in the burden of proof, is there anything that requires industry or anyone to demonstrate that the interaction of substances that Canadians are exposed to are not in themselves the problem, that the interaction is not the problem rather than one individual product? Is there that kind of burden of proof?
I think it's important to talk a little bit about the risk assessment process and how it works. Because at the end of the day, and I'll fast forward the tape very quickly, but the ministers have to convince the governor and council. That's the ultimate test. And so,
say that again, please.
In order to get on Schedule 1 of SEPA, the ministers have to convince the governor and council. They have to provide them with enough information that something meets the criteria under SEPA, 64, A, B, and C, harms the environment, that on which life depends, or human health. That's, at the end, what the threshold that needs to be cleared at. If you go back to the beginning, though, the risk assessments that the two departments do are, in I think both our departments' opinions, really quite rigorous. They do attempt to to properly identify what are the risks and to provide sound scientific advice for the ministers as they move forward. They are peer-reviewed, and they do not have an objective of let's declare everything toxic or not. They are intended to be balanced science representation, and there are processes in both departments, science advisory boards, how these people are promoted, how their performance is dealt with, that is based on their objectivity in that regard. So at the end of the day, we have to produce a risk assessment that deals with our understanding of the risk to the environment, to human health, or that on which life depends. We are also required to take a look at, is there a potential for this substance in terms of how it releases into the environment, how it breaks down. We look at different age groups. We can, if we feel that there is obvious mixtures, look at those as we do them. So we take a look at the chemical, how it's used, the products it's used in, the potential for exposure, and then based on that, provide advice to the ministers.
Okay, thank you.
I thought I saw, well, first of all, I want to know, Mr. Arsenault, whether you had anything to add to that, because I saw both hands go up, and then secondly, Ms. Ginsburg wanted to come in.
I do have a slight bit to add to that, and it's on your excellent question about how synergistic effects may be assessed. This is a very new and difficult area in the science of risk assessment because it's often hard to understand all of the context for these interactive exposures. But our more complex assessments do indeed try to come to grips with this to some degree. A good example of that is the assessment that we did on smog, in essence, to understand what kinds of atmospheric contaminants combine in order to form the essential components of smog, how that happens, and what the right levels of those precursors would be in order to avoid risk. As well, quite often what we'll do is we will look at what a particular substance degrades to in the environment and what the impacts of those degradation products might be. But it is an extremely difficult scientific question to be able to understand all of the various components of that, but it is an area of our ongoing research.
Ms. Ginsburg, very, very briefly.
I would just add that the fundamental process which governs the assessment is a substance-by-substance approach, which just by nature of the approach means that cumulative effects considerations are not adequately addressed.
Of the precautionary principle.
Absolutely.
Thank you. No, that's it. Mr. Warawa.
Mr. Chair. Just speaking to the management of the substances, I get quite excited about a piece of legislation, C30, Canada's New Clean Air Act, that's being going to be discussed, but how it relates to SEPA and what we're discussing right now. It proposes to add additional flexibility in regulation-making authorities. The bill would allow regulations made under specific parts of the Act to distinguish among persons' works, undertakings, or activities in order to protect the environment, human life, and health on the basis of factors such as quantities of releases, production capacity, and technology or techniques used. Proposes to extend authorities related to products that contain toxic substances, including specific air pollutants and greenhouse gases, to products that may release such substances during the course of intended use. So it's quite relevant and exciting. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, a question to our department staff. Has the government consistently met its deadlines on substances entering the commerce before proper assessment? Or without proper assessment? Have we met those deadlines?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I can confirm that we have.
It's good news. So the last priority substance list was published in 1995, I believe. Mm-hmm. Is there a plan for a third priority substance list?
Do you want to take
that? At this point in time, both ministers are looking at the results of the categorization exercise and have announced their intention to come forward with a plan to deal with those results. So at this point in time, that's advice to the ministers.
Okay. Thank you for the brief answers. It gives me opportunity to ask Mrs. Ginsburg about the missing data. You were talking about that in your presentation. If you could elaborate, and Ms. Combs likely would want to make comments on that too, the missing data and substances not being managed properly because of that.
Absolutely. There is a problem of missing data, or as the substance are referred to, the uncertain substances, because we don't know. That's an issue primarily with the existing substances which have just undergone the categorization process. I would argue that even with the new substances which do have to submit a data set, as I mentioned, there are areas of that data set which could be strengthened, and one of which comes to mind is chronic toxicity, which would indicate a lot of carcinogenic effects. So that is something which is not adequately dealt with in the new substances regulations. With respect to the existing substances in the categorization process, as I mentioned, where there is not enough data to indicate toxicity, bioaccumulation, persistent, with the high exposure, the substance is not looked at further. So those are a certain set of criteria, and either because there's just no data or that it's of an extremely poor quality, if there's not sufficient indication that those criteria are met, then the substance does not get quote-unquote categorized in, and therefore doesn't move on to the next more in-depth assessment phase. So that would not be an example, I would say, of a precautionary approach, because those substances which are fundamentally missing data may still pose significant threats to human health or the environment.
Well, I thought that the categorization process, because it was science-based, there was science there you had to make some determination if it met the criteria, if it was persistent, bioaccumulative, inherently toxic, or greatest potential for human exposure. So there is science to make a determination of the 23,000, and the result is we have 4,000 that require further assessment. And again, I mean, the government was set the parameters of the science that would be involved in that program, and will be involved in the setting the science and the parameters of what science will need to be part of the second phase, the screening phase. And I think that it's a bit misleading to say that there isn't evidence out there, because the government is going to be looking at a wide range of data. While they look at other jurisdictions, they can also use other programs that are in place. I mentioned the high volume, for example, program that they'll be looking at as well. If there is a data gap, that appearance is a data gap, before a determination can be made about that product being, or that substance being continued to be used in Canada, industry will be challenged to provide that data to the government, for the government to make their assessment, determine if that substance can continue to be used.
Mr. Glover, quickly.
Just very briefly, perhaps on a slightly different tack, because of the way this discussion has evolved, some points that I think are relevant, and I think Dr. Katter kind of raised this, and I want to come back to them. They are very relevant to this discussion. So first and foremost, it's important to think that or to recognize there is not a silver bullet in all of this stuff. If we demanded information from industry, as we do now, the departments still have an obligation to assess that, to determine if we can replicate that, if it's sound, if it's repeatable, and then work to draw conclusions. So when you take a look at how we receive that data, we do have to validate it, make sure it is done according to standards, and replicate it. The other point in all of this is that the science is evolving. So to ask for information on things like mixtures, cumulative effects, those are areas where we are concerned, but the science and its ability to answer that is still evolving. And in some of these, it's areas where actually more research is needed, not just in Canada, but internationally. And there is an understanding of that. So And if you take a look at the 23,000 chemicals, the number of potential mixtures, the number of ingredients that go into any one product, you could keep both departments busy for a long, long time on just one substance.
Thank you. And the last question goes to Mr. Scarpaleggia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quickly, just to clarify, I'm new to the committee, and I know the domestic substances list is the list of 23,000 substances in trade. The toxic substances list versus the domestic substances list, I'm not too clear on that. Maybe.
Thank you very much for that question, because it's a very useful
sorry, and the priority substances list.
Oh, I see, the priority substances list.
That's right, yeah.
Wanting all three? You want a sorting out of all these three lists?
Well, domestic, toxic, and priority, yeah.
Okay. The domestic substances list are all of those chemicals that
in trade, yeah.
are in trade in sufficient volume, and it's been added to over the years as things come through our new chemicals program. The toxic substances list is Schedule 1 in CEPA, where the government has concluded that a substance is toxic and requires management under the Act, and therefore things go onto that list. A priority substances list is a list that the ministers from time to time may nominate or declare certain substances as priority for assessment, for risk assessment. And we have had 2 PSL lists in the past and have conducted assessments on those. That actually represented just under 70 assessments. But because some of those were larger classes or combinations, represented many more discrete substances than simply the number of assessments.
Now, categorization relates to?
The domestic substances list. It was to take a look at the entire suite of those legacy substances in commerce in order to determine whether they met the categorization criteria as established in the Act.
Mr. Larson, you mentioned you were almost shut out of, or salt, it was almost, road salt was almost shut out of Japan?
Yes.
So as I understand, the Japanese were taking advantage of a situation to create a non-tariff barrier. Is that?
No. They import their fertilizers. They don't have domestic production. They were simply afraid that their public would lose confidence in their food production system if they allowed Canadian potash into their marketplace, and we're looking at banning it on that basis. So no, it wasn't a matter of them trying to create an advantage for a domestic industry or anything like that.
How did you overcome that? How did you overcome the challenge? How did you succeed in preventing that door from closing?
We and a few members of Parliament and a number of executives and scientists in my industry dedicated a huge amount of effort and time to try to explain to them that essentially the Canadian government didn't know what it was doing.
But this is why I don't. So they said, let me just get this straight. They said, okay, our people are afraid because your potash has been declared toxic under Canada's own definition.
Yeah.
So we're not going to import this anymore. But you've explained it to us, the leaders of industry and government, and therefore we don't believe the consumer will be afraid anymore.
We've spent a lot of time explaining to the Japanese government the system that was used in Canada, the legislation, the fact that while Environment Canada did declare road salts to be CEPA toxic, the Governor and Council refused to add it to Schedule 1. Okay, and at this point in time, we have been able to maintain a level of confidence in our products in Japan, and I would say that we're pretty confident that we will be able to maintain that level of confidence into the future.
Do you think that the case of road salt is, you talked a lot about that case. Do you think it's representative in terms of being a kind of, business case to be used for challenging the SEPA, specifically its toxic labeling, or is it a very simple case compared to many of the others that SEPA deals with? I don't know if you understand my question, but
I'm not sure. Maybe I'll try to answer it this way. The Deputy Minister of the Environment appeared before this committee about a year and a half ago and stated that the use of the word toxic to describe substances such as ammonia and road salt was inappropriate, and that there were better solutions, basically.
Ms. Ginsburg, is there a way around? Is there a compromise solution where we won't be hindering, maybe more benign substances, but yet we could still have the SEPA toxic label for everything?
Let me, because I noticed that Ms. Ginsburg has been trying to get in, and we're also out of time, let me give the last word if you would like to answer that question, or...
Yeah, two things. One, as we are out of time, I just wanted to mention that we do have a full submission which is currently being translated, and it will be available to you within a day or two. Second of all, I think that the concern from industry is that their substances will be, I think the term that they've been using is stigmatized by the use of the term toxic, and this term is not arbitrarily applied. It is applied following a rigorous assessment, and often there is due reason for concern. So I would close on that note.
Thank you very much. We are to time. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, witnesses, for coming, and thank you, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow morning at 9 on another subject.
In the same room.
In the same room.
you.